Hello and welcome to an audience with Gore Vidal. I say that because although this month's book has a finite number of pages between its cover, like any other, it's more of a gateway into a life than a subject on its own, and we might well end up anywhere. That's as well for a guest whose visit marks the 10th anniversary of this programme. It's a moment for a man of letters and a man of the world, all wrapped up in one, and here he is. Gore Vidal's point-to-point navigation is in a sense a game because he describes it as a memoir from the early 60s onwards, but it's nothing of the sort. He takes us where he will, into his family, his friends, he has of course known everyone, his country, which these days tests him very sorely, and his art. Although he's a novelist of renown, as well as an essayist, a screenwriter, polemicist, critic, he says there's no such thing as a famous novelist now, and at the very opening of the book he says that as he moves graciously, he hopes, towards the door marked exit, he realises that the only thing he ever liked to do was to go to the movies. Well, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. But of course that affair with Hollywood does catch his character quite nicely. American, in love with style, steeped in all the public dramas of the 20th century, a master of the telling image that lasts, passionate, mercurial, maybe even irresistible. Gore Vidal, welcome to Bookclub.
Thank you, Bookclub. I like to think of myself as an avatar of Mark Twain, who always stayed at the Langham Hotel over here for something like 2,000 years.
How do you see your relationship with him these days?
Oh, it's not uneasy. We're getting on marvelously well. We're both anti-imperialists, and we're both mean.
I'm struck by the way that, culturally speaking, you think that the novel is dead, or at least dying, and its survival here to a greater extent than it survives in America, in your view, is because we still cling on to a few anachronisms.
You still like to talk, for God's sake. Americans can't talk. Well, we don't know. I mean, let me tell you where I'm coming from. That's not what I really think, but, you know, where I'm coming from. You can't get a straight answer out of an American. They babble. Your problem is you all kept on reading, and you had some very good writers. I'm not going to, swell your heads any larger than they are, but you've had some awfully good writers over the last 100 years. It's the time that I've been active. And I've always told younger writers, when I was myself one, the United States hates its own writers. They really hate us. Between Mailer and me, we had more bad reviews than Osama bin Laden got.
Let's have the first question.
I have a question about writing. You've said you wanted to write from an early age. You wanted to write novels. When did you realize that your own life had become interesting enough to merit a memoir?
A journalist told me that. Rather than let them write it, I took over myself. You realize at a certain point there's only so much substance to you, and that you've got to determine what you want to record. I am now the victim of something like 8 biographies, usually by Australians and Canadians. Well, nothing wrong with them. They're a lot better than most Americans, but I decided that I owed it to my grandfather, I owed it to myself, I owed it to the people out of which I came. And who are they? The American Populist Party of 1898, founded by my great-grandfather. Everybody says, oh, that's populist rhetoric. Well, I'm not rhetoric. I'm just a populist, period. So you have to set a record straight.
So you wanted to write a memoir which was in your own words and wasn't imposed on you. The wonderful thing about point-to-point navigation, like palimpsest, the predecessor memoir, it lists, in a sense, although that's a very pejorative-sounding word, the encounters that you've had in your life with, it seems, everybody. Grace Kelly in Rome, you talk about popes, Princess Margaret, you talk about every American politician we've ever heard of. I mean, do you see them dancing before your eyes like some ghostly galère? Are they with you still?
It's more like St. Vitus' dance. No, I have special memories, that's all. Growing up in Washington in a senatorial family, And I have memories of how we got into World War II, thanks to the British Secret Service, who were all over the town. And it was kind of interesting, because I got to meet everybody who was going to be very brilliant in the next generation of UK people. Does anybody here know John Foster? Attorney General in the last cabinet of Winston Churchill. He was all over Washington trying to draw us into the war against Hitler. And my grandfather was the leader of the isolationist party in the United States Senate. They had to win him. And I sat there at his feet listening to all the arguments England, I thought the arguments England was giving were wonderful, because I had seen That Hamilton Woman, Mrs. Miniver, a dread movie, God knows, but still. The propaganda was ferocious. And it would take a real cad, like Evelyn Waugh, to say they all fled the draft. Well, he went into the army and, practically lost Crete because of him. He was the world's worst soldier. And he was an awful man, too, may I say, just tangentially. Forgive me, all England, but...
Well, that deals with him.
I think we can move on.
What I find fascinating about the later novels in your great series, which takes us through American history, is that you picture American politics, obviously for the reason that you've just given us, but for a deeper reason as well, in terms of families. You see them in Washington in their great houses, intermarrying, moving between each other. And it gives a very interesting point of view on how American politics works. It's not simply your own experience, but there's something more profound in your observation, isn't there?
Well, none of us was called Plantagenet, but at the same time we did run the country. And we're running the empire as of this moment. Not very successfully, but that's for another debate.
Let's have a question here.
Your memoirs give an impression that you've dedicated as much of your adult life to Europe, especially Italy, as to your beloved America. Given that you're passionate about America, are there any easy reasons for the serial exiles, during which you've taken a decision to leave the USA and live elsewhere?
That's journalistic melodrama. I never left it. I stay with my subject wherever I am. I mean, geography doesn't mean a lot to me.
So physically, you were writing a lot of the American political fiction, the historical fiction, in Italy on the Amalfi Coast.
Yes, it was, it's turning out rather well, I thought.
So
I think I see two things coming out of that. One is you've got America with you wherever you go. The other thing is that something like Julian and Creation are those refigurations of the USA?
Of course not. We were never that good.
No.
What's the question here?
My own introduction to your writing 40 years ago was the essays, obviously a major part of your work. Like so many other readers, I've always found them richly rewarding, beautifully written and elegantly entertaining. Should we be worried about the future of the essay?
The novel will go first. The essay will go on. Where else can I sit? And I had to relearn all politics about a year ago, and I finally got around to reading Aristotle. And he is chuntering away in my brain. How all republics fail. In the American, we care about republics. In a perfect nation like this, you don't care, but we do, or think we do. And it is also an occasion to write very well. You can't be sloppy in an essay. You've got to pull it off. So I naturally love the form.
And the American form of the long magazine piece, which has been so celebrated, and so many great American
Only by
writers.
foreigners.
Well, it just seems to me to be something that's almost uniquely American in its style.
Anybody who thinks that Truman Capote was a great writer who developed a new style deserves the madhouse. I mean, it's just a sheer ridiculousness.
I wasn't going to use him as the example, but...
He just said, I've invented a new art form. You must realize
that what I have done has never been done before. I said, yes, it's called journalism, you fool.
Well, indeed, that's what it was. There's a question here.
Well, the most wonderful bits of writing in this book are your descriptions of the death of your long-term partner, Howard. On a more theological point, though, I was wondering, because this book is an awful lot to do with mourning and loss of old friends, and I know your views on the three sky god religions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, but in light of the loss and mourning, have you moved more towards a position where you're more sympathetic to these religions?
No, Thomas Jefferson, whom I very much admire, he was sort of summing up his life in a couple of letters to his surviving daughter. And he said, I have been able, in the course of a long and painful life, emotionally and so on, I have been quite aware of the torments that we all go through. But he said, the one emotion I cannot accommodate in my sense is grief. I'm a Jeffersonian.
Reference was made there to your description of the last days, the last years of your friend Howard Auster, with whom you lived for so long. It's a terribly moving series of passages in the book. It's the first time I think you've written about him in that way, isn't it?
It's the first time I ever wrote about anybody in that way. You deal with life as it comes, and it comes. And loss, and I'm not going to brood about it. Nor was he. And we were both pretty hard customers on this subject. Death was it, period. I don't think he had any religious beliefs. He was Jewish to begin with. So therefore I've been accused in England recently of being an anti-Semite. I mean, come on. How idiotic can you get? Well, Americans get more so.
Would you like to read for us from the beginning of the book? I can open it here for you.
I assume it's the ultimate narcissism is to read your books to other people, captive. As I now move graciously, I hope, toward the door marked exit, it occurs to me that the only thing I ever really liked to do was go to the movies. Naturally, sex and art always took precedence over cinema, but neither ever proved to be as dependable as the filtering of present life through that moving strip of celluloid which projects past images and voices onto a screen. Thus, in a seemingly simple process, screening history. I was born October 3rd, 1925, on the 25th birthday of Thomas Wolfe, the novelist, not the journalist. I have lived through 3/4 of the 20th century, and about 1/3 of the history of the United States of America. Briefly, what has been your impression thus far, Mr. Vidal? And eager interviewers are wont to ask. Well, it could have been worse. I begin with a calculated understatement. Then the Japanese recording machine goes on the blink, and while the interviewer tries to fix it, he asks me to tell him off the record, what was Marilyn Monroe really like? As I barely knew her, I tell him.
Yes, it's a great opening.
And closing.
Over the years, I've enjoyed enormously your many essays and books, as well as those of Saul Bellow. Now, Saul Bellow received the Nobel Prize. I wonder why you haven't received a similar accolade.
Perhaps I have, and nobody told you. I mean, the press does keep a lot of us quiet.
Who is the greatest living American novelist? I know. I think for listeners, I should say that you spread your arms out in a wonderfully...
and I took the listeners into my arms and heart.
Indeed. Updike is still writing.
He is depressing, you know. So and the fact that Updike appeals to all of the people I cannot stand in life.
That's why I mentioned it.
That's why I'm answering you.
You're listening to Book Club on BBC Radio 4. Gore Vidal is talking about his memoir, Point-to-Point Navigation.
I wanted to ask you a question about Tennessee Williams. You refer to him through Point to Point as the glorious bird, and that's of course how he introduces Stanley at the beginning of Streetcar Named Desire as a finely feathered bird. Where did the nickname come from?
Me? I didn't even know he did that with Stanley.
Yeah.
Well, he must have done it during a rewrite in which he used a lot of my lines.
Why did you call him the bird?
Read him. The glorious bird is all over his prose. Oh, I want to take you back in time to Glorious Hill, where I first grew up. I found that chance was a bird who died, still traveling, his bones in position for flight. Well, why else call him anything but the glorious bird?
Fits perfectly. Thank you.
You talk very affectionately about Paul Bowles in the memoir, and I've never read Paul Bowles, I confess, but I'm obviously tempted to do so.
And I just reviewers here that they haven't brought him to your attention.
Quite. I just wondered, where would one start as a beginner?
The Sheltering Sky.
The Sheltering Sky.
Bad movie, but good novel.
What is it about The Sheltering Sky that moves you?
What does the image mean to anyone here, the sheltering sky? It's not abstruse, it's not difficult. The sky that seems so formidable in North Africa, and so deadly, because you're going to die under it. You will run out of food, you will run out of life. The sky shelters you from knowing this, and when you know you're not going to survive it. It's a memento mori.
You, in Point-to-Point Navigation, refer to Greta Garbo. Could you please continue?
Well, she always referred to herself as a boy. Oh, could you take me to the little boy's room? And you'd have to take her to the little boy's room, which was not much different from the little girl's room, but she would always leave with the seat up, showing she was a good little boy. Oh, Garbo was something. Tennessee asked her, I remember this was after a Streetcar Named Desire, and like everybody else, Garbo, she was very impressed by it. And the bird came to her at a party of John Gunther, a journalist of the day. I was present. And he said, you know, Miss Garbo, I won't write movies for anybody. I hate it now. But I'll write you any movie you want to play. Just tell me, what part do you want to play? And she said, don't make me a man, don't make me a woman. That's a good prescription for a great film. And he didn't do it. And there was a producer who came up with a script which wasn't bad, of the Duchesse de Langeais, Balzac. She was tempted to do it. And Howard Hughes was one of the nastiest brats that ever came out of the American pack. Had bought RKO Pictures and cancered Garbo. He said, I don't like her and I don't want to do a movie with her. And she quit forever. And she had not intended to quit. Visconti tried to get her back to play the Queen of Naples in a film. All she has to do is wander through in a great gown. She was scared. She didn't want to be fired again.
Did she lose her nerve?
I think so.
I believe you were the Edward R. Morrow of the 1997 British elections. There's some beautifully observed comments in the book about Tony Blair smiling for the cameras with Gordon Brown glowering in the background. Do you think Americans have any interest in our elections, apart from those who were born into politics?
I do. I covered the first election of Blair, held off at a great distance by a very willowy young man called Mandelbaum or something.
We know. But the psychology of the politics there is obviously something that still grips you, even in your own republic, which you find so depressing.
I know how these societies work, that's all. And I know the problems that Jack Kennedy had with the likes of Hubert Humphrey and this one and that one and all the deals that were made. Oh, and it is a deal. You quiet down and I will govern, and we'll work it out later. Famous last words. Jack Kennedy once said to me, this is when I was running for Congress, any time a politician tells you, if you want anything go, just come to me, you know you're finished.
You were friendly with Jack Kennedy and some of his family, but when and what point did your estrangement from the family, particularly
I had
Jackie,
a fight
occur?
with Bobby, whom I loathed.
Yes.
For good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And if I ever get around to writing about it all, you'll know exactly, battle by battle. I had great joy in showing Hillary, when she was first mistress of the land, first lady of the land, through the White House. The point where I told Bobby to go screw himself in my most elegant manner. She said, should we put up a plaque? I said, I don't think they'll allow you to, because the White House is strictly run by the bureaucracy.
I mean, your writing about JFK himself after the period had passed was relatively limited, wasn't it?
What was there to write about? I didn't admire the invasion of Cuba. I did not admire turning into a hard war in Southeast Asia. I didn't like that for 1,000 days. That's busyness. And I ended up disapproving. So, nothing surprising in that.
There's one here.
You mentioned a minute ago your run for the U.S. House of Representatives, and I wanted to ask you a question about that.
I won it, and I was asked back to run again 4 years later in 1964, when it was a clean sweep for the Democratic Party.
So about that episode, you made, by any accounts, a very good run for it, and yet you don't have those traditional props that most American politicians have.
Isn't that a relief?
Yeah, well, for many of us, yes. You didn't have a beautiful blonde wife who had given you a couple of campaign props as children. You never made a secret about being a third-generation atheist. It's really hard to imagine somebody like that getting so far in a federal election today in the U.S., and I'm just wondering what you think may have changed. Have we gone backwards as a society? Has the press changed the way it covers people?
No, the press is as awful as it's always been. It's there for scandal and argument. It was more interesting when I stood for a Senate seat in California against the sitting governor, Jerry Brown, and I got 500,000 votes and didn't spend a penny. That was very impressive.
That's one of the biggest things that's changed.
It was very impressive for California Democratic Party.
In the historical series of novels, the American historical series of novels, which is the one of which you're most fond or most proud? Burr, Lincoln, or the later ones?
Well, I think I found a Lincoln that others had not found. And instead of being this sort of melancholy creep that he's always depicted as, that he was a sharp, tough politician. And very funny. It was the humor I liked in Lincoln. No, I was quite happy I wrote that.
The lady here.
In point-to-point navigation, you say that you suggested the race to put a man on the moon.
I did.
To JFK.
I did.
Which possibly helped divert war from a physical type of war on this planet.
One hopes so, yeah.
So I wonder if, in some parallel universe, you could become president at the next election, what would you do? Do you think it is possible to stop war, or is it too great a necessity to the American economy? And would you do...
We always thought it was the British economy we were serving, you know. World War I and II. I mean, we are interlinked.
Yes.
If you did become president in some parallel universe, what would you do?
Resign. Well, I hope I would be less schmarmy than Cousin Albert.
Do you still call him Albert?
I don't call him Al, for Christ's sake.
Exactly, that was my point.
Yeah, no, that's being folksy. Hi, Al. Can you imagine anybody calling Albert Al? He's the stiffest man I've ever met. He's a Gore, for God's sake. It's like Mount Rushmore wandering around. And he doesn't have to get any votes anymore, and God knows I don't, so we're both out of Al.
Remind us how the title came about, by the way.
Well, in World War II, I enlisted, and I was first mate of an army ship. Was I a good first mate? I was a dreadful first mate. But I didn't kill anybody, and didn't sink my boat. And it was an appalling experience because you have to navigate a ship. I was first mate. You couldn't navigate it because we never saw the sun. We never saw the light of day. We never saw the moon.
You were in the Northern Seas.
We were in the Aleutian Islands. And, of course, we couldn't navigate. I've had all sorts of... You seem to forget, sir, that you had a compass, and you can do it with that. Well, you can't do it with that if you can't read it. I've had irritable exchanges with stay-at-home navigators. It was not fun.
So you did the navigation by choosing 2 points on the map and simply heading from one to the other?
What you had to do was get an Aleut Indian boy, which I got. He had memorized the entire coastline of Adak and Attu and all of the islands that I had to contend with. And he saved us all from being dead.
For which we're profoundly grateful.
Thank you.
Yes.
Point-to-point navigation seems like an interesting way to travel. It certainly seems to have some uncertainty and some risk. It seems to say that we can only move from one thing to the next, not quite sure where we're going or indeed whether we're going to get there, but perhaps amused by the patterns that we make along the way. How has point-to-point served your writing, or if you prefer, your life?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. It's defined it.
It's defined it. Gore Vidal, thank you very much indeed for being our guest on Book Club.